Have you ever paused, truly paused, to feel your breath? Not in a rush, not while checking your phone, not while chasing another task on your endless to-do list, but simply to notice the rise and fall of your chest, the cool touch of air as it enters your nostrils, the warmth as it leaves, the steady, constant rhythm that has been with you since the moment you entered this world. Most of us move through our days like passengers on a speeding train, eyes fixed on the next station, barely noticing the beauty rushing past the window. We live in a world that glorifies busyness, multitasking, and endless distraction. And yet, within every passing moment, there's a quiet doorway to something ancient, something sacred, a wisdom that has been whispered through temple halls, written on crumbling scrolls, and passed from master to student for over 2,000 years. It is a wisdom that says, peace is not found by escaping the world, but by fully arriving within it. This is the heart of mindfulness, not a trend, not a productivity hack, but a profound art of truly being alive. Today, I invite you to join me on a journey, a return to stillness in a restless world. Together, we'll explore what mindfulness truly means, where it comes from, why it matters, and how it holds the power to transform not only how you see the world, but how you live within it. We'll unravel ancient stories and practical wisdom passed down through centuries of Buddhist thought. And along the way, I'll share simple, meaningful practices you can weave into your own daily life, no monastery required. So before we begin, I invite you to take one simple, sacred action. Breathe, right now, wherever you are. Feel it, notice it, for this breath is your life. As we open this journey, know this: you don't need to be a monk to discover peace. You don't need to abandon your job, your family, or your modern life. The wisdom we seek is not hidden in mountaintop monasteries. It's here, in this very moment, in the stillness between thoughts, in the space between breaths, and if you listen closely, you might just hear it. So, let us begin at the beginning. To understand mindfulness, we must first return to its roots, to the ancient forests of India, where over 25 centuries ago, an awakened being known as the Buddha revealed a path to freedom from suffering, a path built not on blind belief, but on the simple, profound act of paying attention. To truly understand mindfulness, we must journey back through centuries of human longing, past empires risen and fallen, beyond the noise of modern life, back to a time when wisdom was spoken not in books, but in the hush of dawn and the flicker of a lamp in a humble hermit's hut. Over 2,500 years ago, in the ancient forests of northern India, a seeker wandered. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who had renounced his palace and riches, leaving behind everything he knew to answer one timeless question: why do we suffer, and how can we be free? For years, Siddhartha walked the forests and villages, studying under the most respected spiritual teachers of his time. He mastered techniques of deep concentration, ascetic practices, and renunciation. Yet still, peace eluded him. Until one silent evening, beneath the shade of a sprawling Bodhi tree, he turned inward, not chasing wisdom and distant philosophies, but observing the one constant companion he had always carried, his own mind. He noticed the arising and passing of thoughts, the pull of desire, the sting of aversion, and within that simple, steady awareness, something shifted. On the dawn of the full moon, Siddhartha awoke, not from sleep, but from ignorance. From that moment, he became known as the Buddha, the awakened one. Among the profound insights he shared with the world, one teaching held particular power. It was called sati in the Pali language, a word we now know as mindfulness. But in its original form, sati meant more than awareness. It meant to remember, to recollect, not just to notice your breath or your footsteps, but to remember the true nature of reality, to awaken from the trance of distraction and truly arrive in the present moment. The Buddha taught that suffering arises because we are lost in craving, lost in aversion, lost in ignorance. We grasp for what is pleasant, flee what is painful, and miss the sacredness of the moment unfolding right in front of us. And so he offered mindfulness as a medicine, not as an escape, but as a lamp to illuminate the restless patterns of the mind. He instructed his disciples to be mindful in 4 primary ways: of the body, the movement, the posture, the breath; of feelings, the subtle waves of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral sensations; of the mind, the shifting states of thought and emotion; and of dhammas, the laws and truths that govern existence. This simple yet radical act of observing the present moment became a cornerstone of the Buddha's path. One spoke in the wheel of the Noble Eightfold Path, the ancient guide to ending suffering. In time, these teachings spread, from humble gatherings beneath trees to great monasteries across India, Sri Lanka, Burma, and beyond. Masters and monks passed down the wisdom of mindfulness through poems, chants, and countless silent sittings. But always, at its heart, the message remained the same. Peace is found not by changing the world, but by changing how we see it. And so here we stand today, centuries later, in a world the Buddha could not have imagined. Glowing screens, towering cities, endless noise. And yet the invitation of mindfulness remains unchanged. It calls us, as it called them, to turn inward, to pause, to see. Now that we've glimpsed the ancient roots of mindfulness, let's ask a deeper question. What does mindfulness truly mean? What is this practice, this art, that has survived millennia and crossed cultures? At its core, mindfulness is simple yet profound. It is the act of paying attention, intentionally, in the present moment, without judgment. But what does that really look like in our tangled, noisy minds? Imagine your thoughts as clouds drifting across the sky, some dark and stormy, others light and wispy. Most of us spend our days chasing after these clouds, gripping some, pushing others away, or trying desperately to stop the sky from changing at all. Mindfulness invites us instead to become the sky itself, to open wide and let the clouds pass freely, without clinging or resistance. It means noticing when your mind wanders into worry, fear, or frustration, and gently bringing it back to the breath, the body, the moment. In Buddhist philosophy, mindfulness plays a vital role in breaking the cycle of suffering, because it's through mindfulness that we can begin to see clearly the 3 poisons that cloud our minds: craving, the endless grasping for what we desire; aversion, the pushing away of what we dislike; ignorance, the fundamental misunderstanding of reality. These 3 fuel a constant loop of dissatisfaction, pulling us deeper into pain. Mindfulness, then, is not merely noticing. It's awareness without attachment. It's the courage to look honestly at our experience, even the uncomfortable parts, without flinching, without judgment. This is the foundation of true freedom. But mindfulness is more than just an individual skill. It's a way of relating to life itself. Imagine walking through a forest. Instead of rushing through to reach the other side, mindfulness invites you to notice the intricate patterns on each leaf, the subtle chorus of birdsong, the texture of the earth beneath your feet. It's about showing up fully to the miracle of ordinary moments. And in doing so, Mindfulness reveals a surprising truth, that the present moment is all we ever really have. The past is memory, the future is imagination. But this moment, right here, right now, is where life unfolds. Let me share a story from Zen tradition, a teaching about presence. A master and his student were walking through a village when a sudden commotion broke out. People rushed past, anxious and shouting. The student asked, "Master, why are they so afraid?" The master replied, "Because they are not here." The student was puzzled. "Not here? What do you mean?" The master smiled gently and said, "Their minds are elsewhere, lost in the past or the future." Fear arises when we abandon the present moment. This is the power of mindfulness, to bring us home, again and again, to the now. So, what does mindfulness truly mean? It means stepping off the endless treadmill of distraction. It means choosing to see clearly, to feel deeply, and to accept without resistance. It is a radical invitation to be fully human, with all our imperfections, joys, and sorrows. And while the path may not always be easy, each moment of mindfulness is a seed planted, a step toward awakening. We've traveled far, from the ancient forests where the Buddha first taught mindfulness, to this very moment in our fast-paced digital world. But what does mindfulness look like today? How has this ancient practice found a place amidst the endless notifications, the rush of deadlines, and the constant hum of technology? Over the past few decades, mindfulness has blossomed beyond monasteries and meditation halls. It's become a global phenomenon, embraced by psychologists, educators, doctors, and even corporate leaders. You've probably heard of mindfulness apps, stress reduction courses, or maybe even practiced a quick breathing exercise during a busy work day. And that's a beautiful thing. These modern adaptations make mindfulness accessible to millions, offering a lifeline in an often overwhelming world. But it's important to remember, the roots of mindfulness run far deeper than the apps on our phones. Originally, mindfulness was not just about relaxation or stress relief. It was a radical practice of awareness aimed at awakening the mind, seeing reality as it truly is, beyond illusions and distractions. In some ways, the modern mindfulness movement has simplified this ancient wisdom, focusing on the benefits of calm and focus, which are indeed powerful. Yet, the Buddha's original teaching invites us to go further. Imagine this. You receive a harsh comment online. Your first impulse might be to react instantly, defend yourself, retaliate, or feel hurt. Mindfulness asks you to pause, to observe your feelings as they arise, without immediately jumping into action. It's not about suppressing emotions or pretending everything is fine. It's about creating space, that precious gap between stimulus and response. In that space lies freedom. Freedom from reactive patterns that cause suffering, misunderstanding, and conflict. This modern context challenges us to reclaim the depth of mindfulness, to remember that it's not a quick fix, but a lifelong journey. A practice that teaches patience, compassion, not only for others, but for ourselves. Because the world we live in can be chaotic, confusing, and sometimes painful. And mindfulness gives us a way to navigate this complexity with clarity and grace. To understand mindfulness more deeply, sometimes words alone are not enough. That's why the Zen tradition has long used stories, simple, often surprising tales, to illuminate the path. These stories are not just entertaining anecdotes. They are windows into the heart of awakening, stories that cut through intellectualizing and bring us face to face with the mystery of presence. Let me share one such story, a classic from the teachings of the great Zen master Hakuin. A young samurai came to Hakuin, furious and full of rage. "Master," he said, "someone has spoken ill of me. I demand you tell me how to get revenge." Hakuin looked at him calmly and replied, "Before I answer, tell me, what happens if you carry your sword for too long?" The samurai thought for a moment and said, "My arm will grow tired." "Exactly," said Hakuin. "And what happens if you carry your anger for too long?" The samurai paused, then said quietly, "My heart will grow tired." This story reminds us that holding on to anger, resentment, or grudges is like carrying a heavy burden. Mindfulness offers us a way to set that burden down, to notice our emotions without becoming them, to observe without judgment and find freedom in the simple act of awareness. Another story, from Zen master Bankei, illustrates the power of presence. Bankei taught about the unborn mind, the natural state of clarity and peace within us all. When a student asked how to achieve this state, Bankei said, "You don't need to do anything. It's already here. You just need to realize it." This points to a profound truth of mindfulness. The peace we seek is not somewhere else. It is not something to be earned or acquired. It is the very nature of our own minds, waiting patiently beneath the noise and clutter. Zen stories often carry humor too, like the tale of a monk who, when asked what is the sound of one hand clapping, simply laughed. Why? Because some truths cannot be captured in words or concepts. They must be experienced. This is where mindfulness becomes less about technique and more about direct experience, stepping beyond the thinking mind into pure awareness. Through these stories, Zen teaches us to embrace paradox, mystery, and simplicity, to meet life as it is, not as we wish it to be, to find joy in the ordinary, to be fully present even amidst uncertainty, and to remember, mindfulness is not about achieving perfection. It's about waking up again and again, with kindness, patience, and an open heart. Now that we've uncovered the deep roots of mindfulness and explored its wisdom through stories, it's time to bring this practice into your daily life. You don't need a special place or hours of free time. Mindfulness is accessible to anyone, anywhere, at any moment. And the best part? It begins with something you already have, your breath. Step 1. Pause and breathe. Start by simply pausing. Take a slow, deep breath in. Feel the air filling your lungs. Then gently exhale. This simple act anchors you to the present moment, inviting your mind to settle. You can do this anytime, while waiting in line, before a meeting, or even during a stressful moment. Step 2. Notice sensations. Bring your attention to the physical sensations around you. Feel your feet on the ground. Notice the texture of your clothes. Tune into the rhythm of your heartbeat. Sensations ground you in the here and now, breaking the cycle of distraction. Step 3. Observe your thoughts. Mindfulness isn't about stopping thoughts. It's about noticing them without judgment. Imagine your thoughts as leaves floating down a stream. Watch them come and go without grabbing or pushing. If your mind wanders, gently guide it back to your breath or sensations. No frustration, just kindness. Step 4. Practice regularly. Even a few minutes a day can create a powerful ripple effect. Set aside time each day, morning, evening, or whenever works best for you. Consistency builds a habit that gradually transforms your relationship with yourself and the world. Step 5. Bring mindfulness into daily activities. Mindfulness doesn't have to be separate from your life. Try mindful eating. Savor each bite. Practice mindful walking. Feel each step. Listen mindfully in conversations. Fully present with others. These moments of presence enrich your experience and deepen your awareness. Remember, mindfulness is a journey, not a race or a test. Some days will feel easier, others more challenging. That's part of the process. Be patient with yourself. Celebrate small victories. With each breath, you plant a seed of peace, clarity, and compassion. As we prepare to close this exploration, our final chapter will bring everything together, reflecting on the path, its challenges, and the incredible gift mindfulness offers. Because mindfulness is not just a practice, it's a way of life. Are you ready to walk this path with an open heart? To meet each moment with curiosity and grace? We have journeyed together through the essence of mindfulness. From its ancient origins to its timeless wisdom, and into practical steps for living fully awake. Mindfulness is more than a technique or a momentary escape. It is the path to awakening, a return to ourselves, to the present moment where life truly unfolds. As the Buddha taught, awakening is not about escaping suffering, but embracing it with an open heart and clear mind. It is a continuous process, a dance between awareness and acceptance. Each breath, each moment, is an opportunity to awaken more deeply. This path is not always easy. There will be challenges, distractions, and setbacks. But remember, mindfulness is a practice of patience and compassion, especially toward ourselves. Every small step forward plants a seed of peace that will grow and bloom over time. If this journey has touched you, I invite you to take it further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom for more teachings, stories, and guidance on mindfulness and awakening. Leave your thoughts and experiences in the comments. How has mindfulness touched your life? What challenges do you face on your path? Your voice matters here. Together, we create a community rooted in presence, wisdom, and kindness. Thank you for sharing this moment with me. May your journey be filled with light, clarity, and endless compassion. Remember, the path to awakening begins now, in this very breath.